two events should be shaping the discourse on any conversation about Israeli power and the rise of the European Union as a hyperpower. And the first should be the Arab Spring, which I'm sure the Israeli media has taken note of. Some such as Haaretz, have been supportive, and some on the right and the Kudlight papers have been treated it with a customary Israeli culture of seeing it as a threat. But we cannot be too hard on the Israelis for this, because they have people walking onto buses every week and blowing themselves up. The second may have been ignored by the mainstream Israeli media, and that was the crime against humanity in Oslo. But it has not been completely ignored by both people who are National Socialists in Europe, or people who believe that the Israelis had something to do with Oslo, which I believe is a conspiracy theory which doesn't hold water. But what hasn't been known about, and also has been ignored in both the West and the Israel itself, is the possibility that many of the people in the blogosphere in Israel welcomed such attacks, because the man who Breivik was a pro-Israeli and was described himself as an ultra-conservative and a Freemason. Now, traditionally, Jewish people have been the enemies of Freemasons, and also National Socialists have been the enemies of Freemasons. And if you'd seen my videos on Judaism and moderate European nationalism that precede this video, and you will understand my point of view in that Jews and Europeans, both Jewish nationalists and European nationalists, have to come together in a coalition supported by European Social Democrats, and the Israelis need to adjust themselves to the rise of Europe as a hyperpower. That is the third component of this vid, because as the Arab Spring takes hold and democracy tries to normalise the Arab nations around Israel, because Israel has a third world problem in that it is a regional superpower with 400 nuclear weapons, but it also has an existential threat from the Syrians. It has perhaps lost its ally in Egypt. It has an existential threat not only from the Ba'athist Syrians and Iranian Revolutionary Islamic Republic, which has taken over much of Iraq, but also an existential threat from the Saudi and Bin Laden crime families. So Israel is a very small percentage of the Arabian Peninsula, and with a very small population, its manpower is limited for all the strength of the IDF. Where it should be looking to is not only to the United States with its strategy of tension in the United States, political strategy of tension, of egging up the threat to Israel whilst linking that with American security fears, in which the United States has nothing to gain from supporting Israel strategically. It has no resources that the United States needs. It has no oil. But the political influence of, in some cases, extreme Zionism, and on the more moderate Jewish political spectrum, neoconservatism, although this did result in the Iraq War, so how moderate it can be is debatable. But the more moderate and liberal Jewish diaspora in Europe and the United States, traditionally voting Democrat, or in Great Britain Labour, or in Germany the Social Democrats, has been silenced on these issues by the Likudlites, and Labour, the Israeli Labour Party itself has been, who are Social Democrats, have been silenced by the right-wing theocratic Likud party of Netanyahu. And Netanyahu even tried to school the President of the United States, Barack Obama, on what would happen given that the United States is supposed to be a superpower, but yet it seems to be that the tail is wagging the dog, in it the tail being Israel. But while I'm democratic in my criticism of both the anti-Semitism of National Socialists and in some cases ultra-conservatives, we must be democratic in our criticism of the Israelis, as I have been in this video. Because the Israelis have a threat culture, they see Europe as a threat, and their foreign policy shows in some regard the schizophrenic way that the Israelis view Europe. They are people who are in many cases descendants of European Jews, and yet their whole culture is in Israel, at least, not in the Jewish liberal diaspora, but in Israel, is based on remembering the Holocaust, and thus their view of Europeans is taken through the prism of the Holocaust. This could be seen as understandable, but there has been little public outcry in Israel against other genocides such as Rwanda, what's the million people who are killed every year in China, or other such things, because the Israeli culture, rather than the Jewish diaspora culture, the Israeli culture is inward looking, and that is a problem. Because if the Israelis cannot adapt to Jewish power being incorporated into a European Union rather than challenged by a European Union, they will lose that economically and politically. The fact that Germany is the dominant power and England is in partnership with Germany as the dominant powers within the European Union shows that there is a terrible crux in the Israeli perspective of Europe, in that Germany was the country which fought them in the Second World War, and the British are the country that the Haganah bombed and used terrorism against to get Israeli independence. And so from that perspective, the Israelis see themselves as allies of the West, on the one hand, and they see the West as America, which they have some political control over. But on the other hand, they see Europe as part of the West, but yet they have some enmity towards Europe, and they have enmity towards the Arab Spring. And in this, when I'm talking about Israeli foreign policy, I'm talking about Likud, rather than the Israeli Labour Party, which is more moderate towards Europe. But what the adjustment that I would like to see the Israelis make is that they be more open and they be more friendly with Europe and cooperate more, as the European influence in the Middle East and North Africa through a North African and a Middle Eastern Union and chartered cities develops. Then Israel should see the benefits of European power, hyperpower, and the benefits of the survival of the Roman, Nordic and Celtic peoples. We don't have to be enemies. We can have an alliance between each other, and we can bring the enormous political and intellectual power of the Jewish people together with the enormous intellectual, military, economic and industrial power of Europe and the United States. Because I want a moderate Israel to be part of a wider Western world, a Western mark, which will include much of the Middle East and North Africa, as well as Australasia and a independent Boer Republic and a second Jewish state in the Horn of Africa. And the whole Western world will be unified with a single currency and a single political polity. Thank you for listening.